Hi, this is Sean Paul Murphy, trying to maintain my pledge of reading a chapter of one of my books every week during the coronavirus lockdown. I'm back this week with chapter 3 of my memoir, The Promise, or the Pros and Cons of Talking with God, my true story of first faith and first love, and how the two became almost fatally intertwined. The last chapter was about my death, so I have nowhere to go but back to the beginning. This chapter is about my childhood. I hope you enjoy it. Chapter 3, Childhood. I was born on December 28, 1960. I was the second child of Douglas Ernest Murphy Sr. and Clara Marie Protini. Not only was I their second child, I was their second child born that year. My older brother Douglas was born in February, and in a sense he was very much to blame for my early debut in 1960. I was a little premature. My mother went into labor after Dougie accidentally pulled the Christmas tree down on her. At the time of my birth, my father was 19 years old. My mother was 17. They were married on August 29, 1959. Dougie appeared 6 months later. Enough said? My two doomed siblings followed. Laura Lee Murphy was born on September 16, 1962, and Mark Brendan Murphy followed her on February 26, 1964. There was no hint in their happy childhood faces of the depression and madness that would later drive them to self-destruction. My sister Jeannie Kathleen Murphy rounded out the original quintet in 1965. My kid brother John Christian Murphy was the oops child. He would be born nearly a decade later after my family moved to the larger house on St. Helens Avenue. He wasn't part of the raucous chaos that echoed off the walls of that small house on Hamlet Avenue. My father, Douglas, attended University of Baltimore and worked part-time as a clerk for the Social Security Administration at the time of my birth. In 1966, he graduated magna cum laude with a law degree. He never practiced. He never even attempted to take the bar exam. He had already found his true life's calling as a computer programmer for the Social Security Administration. I would hear his genius touted by friends, family, and total strangers alike over the years. He won many awards and commendations during his long government service and turned down many lucrative opportunities in the private sector. He loved working for SSA. He shared his passion with three of his brothers, Richard, Brian, and Kevin, and brother-in-law Tony, who all joined him at Social Security as computer programmers or systems analysts of one variety or another. I nearly followed him there myself. My father was a lifer. Decades later, even after falling into a permanent alcoholic depression following the deaths of two of his children, he remained a valuable resource at work. My uncle said my father operated in such rarefied air that even when intoxicated, he was sharper than most programmers at their prime. The difficulty was finding problems that stirred his dormant interest. I remember watching a television documentary about computer languages with him near the end of his life. The narrator said computer languages were developed because people couldn't read the series of ones and zeros that computers operated on. Idiots, my father angrily intoned. I don't doubt he could read the zeros and ones. My mother was a full-time mom until the 1980s. Having 5 kids in 5 years certainly kept her hands full. We had a loud family, lots of screaming, lots of yelling, lots of running around, lots of activity. The squeaky wheel definitely got the grease. A quiet kid, by definition, was a good kid. Sometimes it was the way to get lost in the crowd. Our family took weekend road trips to every historical site within 100 miles radius, like Fort McHenry, Harper's Ferry, and various Civil War battlefields. We spent 1 week every summer at Ocean City and later went on raucous whitewater rafting expeditions to the Youghiogheny River accompanied by 80 Social Security workers, family members, and on occasion, crazy outlaw bikers. I liked being a Murphy kid. We were rambunctious and constantly fighting amongst ourselves, except when faced with an outside threat. Then we were a team. We were not a touchy-feely family of hugs and kisses. We weren't always saying I love you, but I honestly always felt loved and secure. We were allowed to be our authentic selves.
Our parents did not press upon us rigid patterns to which we were compelled to conform, like it or not. I was a scrawny little kid, and I had thick brown hair, which started out light but grew darker over the years, and hazel eyes. I was extremely thin. I doubt I was 5 foot anything by the time I graduated. I had large ears, accented by crew cuts inflicted upon me in my youth. No hippies in our house. However, my most distinctive feature was my large nose. Dougie, the official dispenser of Murphy nicknames, dubbed me Rubber Nose. Fortunately, few followed his lead. Still, it would be years before the rest of my face finally caught up with my notable proboscis. Life was good. Life was happy. I had lots of friends and enjoyed playing all the traditional outdoor games of the time. But I was equally, if not more comfortable playing on my own or watching television. Not surprising for someone who had become a professional screenwriter, my favorite place was the Arcade Theater near the corner of Harford Road and Hamilton Avenue. I was still very young when my mother, anxious to get any of her children out of her hair for a few hours, started letting me go alone. I loved walking into a theater on a bright afternoon and staying until it was dark outside. That always made it feel like the world changed while I was at the movies. Start times really didn't matter back then. You came when you came. If you missed the beginning of a film, you just stayed and watched it again. If a movie was good, you could watch it a third time. Movie-going was a perfect hobby for a Rosenberger disposition. It allowed you to sit back and observe in the comfort of silence, rather than actively participate. The quintessential Rosenberger hobby of the previous generation was fishing. Fishing allowed you to get out and spend your time with your buddies in silence. The only things that opened up on those trips were beer cans. I was very cognizant of my tendency to remain alone, and it scared me. I clearly remember sitting alone on the landing of the stairs to our dank basement, thinking that I would never get married. I knew I would never be able to express my true feelings to anyone. I couldn't have been any more than 10 or 12 years old at the time. Who sits around thinking things like that at that age? Maybe a lot of people. Not that I'd ever have known. I would have never dreamed of discussing it with anyone, not at home, not at school either. My siblings and I attended St. Dominic Elementary School. Although my brother Douglas and I attended kindergarten together, I was held back a year before entering first grade. The school had a strict policy of not allowing siblings to start school in the same grade unless they were actual twins. Irish twins like Dougie and myself were out of luck. Actually, I was the one who was out of luck. I had to repeat kindergarten while he moved over to St. D. It isn't particularly surprising my parents decided to send their children to parochial school. Both sides of my mother's family were Catholic. She, like her mother and grandmother before her, attended St. Wenceslas Elementary School before she eventually jumped ship for the public Mercanthaler Vocational Technical High School. Things were a little more complicated on the Murphy side of the family. My paternal grandfather, Paul James Murphy Sr., was extremely Catholic, but his wife, Margaret Angie Robertson, was extremely Presbyterian. They had to marry in secret to avoid the wrath of Margaret's parents, but the question remained how to raise the children. The first 3 boys, Paul Jr., Douglas, and Richard, were baptized Catholic, but Margaret balked after her daughter Carol was born. The pastor of Our Lady of Mount Carmel Church often thundered dire warnings at my grandmother Margaret about the eternal fate of her unbaptized daughter whenever he saw her on the streets of their hometown of Dunmore, Pennsylvania. Margaret refused to relent. A compromise was reached. The boys would be baptized and raised Catholic, while the girls would be predestined to follow their mother into the Presbyterian Church. Peace was restored, and the deal held as Brian and Sharon were born. Margaret reneged at the birth of her last son, Kevin. She wanted her baby to go to church with her, so Kevin was raised Presbyterian like his sisters. My father wasn't much of a churchgoer and had very little say on the subject. Early during my childhood, I remember him going to church on the major holidays like Christmas and Easter, but rarely on any other occasions. Before long, he was generally absent on the holidays. Sunday was reserved for the Murphy Football League, a group of friends and family from Social Security who played touch football on the field at Northern High School. My mother, Clara, was an avid churchgoer and managed to get us kids up and dressed to go with her most of the time. When my mother couldn't attend church, she would send Dougie and me there on our own. We were instructed to bring home a church bulletin as proof of our attendance. Dougie would sneak into the back of the church, grab a bulletin, and then we would have a free morning. I didn't feel particularly guilty about skipping church. I was too young to get anything out of the Mass, especially when said in Latin. But I was always a believer. I always had an innate belief that God existed and that He heard my prayers. I can't remember a time when I didn't believe that. I can't say I was completely orthodox in my theology when I was a child and a preteen. I had an inquisitive mind, and I wondered frequently about the nature of God, not His attributes. I had more practical concerns like, what is spirit? What is God made of? How big was God? Was He the same size as the universe, or was He larger? Could God possibly be a manifestation of our combined human consciousness? I contemplated the nature of eternity, the Trinity, and yes, I must admit it, sometimes I got caught up in the kooky theories of the day. My mother laughed when I came home and announced she could throw her Bible away after I saw Chariots of the Gods, a pseudo-documentary about how the ancients worshipped aliens, based on the kooky Eric von Däniken book of the same name. There were, however, a few tenets of faith I never doubted. God existed, He had a personality, and He took an active and compassionate interest in His children. That was all I needed to know at the time. In my own childish ways, I was debating and examining the issues that troubled philosophers and theologians for centuries, and I was answering them to my satisfaction with any outside help. I would have never dreamed of discussing these issues with one of the priests or nuns. I was very Rosenbergian about my faith. I found my faith to be too private to discuss with others. Still, I took all of the rituals of the Roman Catholic faith very seriously and very thoughtfully. I never thought of rebelling, and I couldn't have done so even if I had the desire. I was going to Catholic school. The rituals were part of our curriculum. I was, however, never an altar boy. Why? Nobody ever asked me. I loved going to St. Dominic's Elementary School. There were about 104 children, give or take a few, depending on the year, in the class of 1975. They were neighborhood kids. I'd already been out on the street playing with many of them before we were even old enough to go to school. Because Hamilton was a working middle-class neighborhood, there were few socioeconomic distinctions between us, or even between us and the kids who went to the public schools. In other words, we were us. In the summer of 1983, my family moved about a half a mile away to 21 St. Helens Avenue. The beautiful 5-bedroom Victorian home sat on top of the second highest hill in the city, 360 feet above sea level. You could see everything from the skyscrapers downtown in the Inner Harbor to the steel mills in Sparrows Point. The house was close enough to Morgan State University to hear its marching band practice on quiet nights. Sometimes you could even hear the crowd roar during an exciting Orioles game at Old Memorial Stadium on 33rd Street. The new house was definitely an upgrade over our small 3-bedroom home on Hamlet Avenue. Although my parents initially assigned us 3 boys to a single large bedroom on the 2nd floor, Dougie and I both staked out separate bedrooms in the comfortable attic. I got the larger room in the back of the house with the fabulous view of Baltimore City. Dougie got the smaller bedroom in the front with an unhindered view across the street into the bedrooms of the nubile Lucerne sisters. That poor family seems like they could never afford to put curtains on the girls' windows. The 7th and 8th grades were the apogee of my childhood. No bullies, no enemies. I liked everybody and everybody liked me. The move brought a new friend into my inner circle. Jim Jackson was a year ahead of me in school, but we became fast friends. The boys and I had great summers. My new house became the summer daytime hangout. An elementary school was located only a few houses away. We played baseball on its green fields every afternoon. During our first year of play, we counted a home run if anyone hit a ball over the fence separating the field from the parking lot. By the second year, we were all bigger and downgraded that feat to a mere double. Around the same time, I started noticing girls. I developed my first true heart-pounding crush on a girl named Jennifer Poskisil. She was the first girl I felt I could talk to, and I did. It was a great feeling. Still, I never attempted to ask her out on a date, despite the fact that some of our more precocious classmates were already dating. That was beyond the realm of my possibilities. Not that I would have known what to do with her anyway. We did have sex education class in the 6th grade. However, Sister Margaret, our instructor, as well versed as she might have been in the subject, didn't necessarily make it sound like anything in which anyone would want to willingly participate. In 1975, I left the world of girls and started attending the all-male Archbishop Curley High School. Unfortunately, my diminutive status immediately caught the attention of the seniors. If the seniors caught you near the back parking lot door and there were no teachers around, you could expect to be thrown into the school dumpster or under the grating where they kept the boilers. If they caught you in the cafeteria with no teachers around, you could expect to be thrown into one of the large garbage cans. No big deal, nothing personal. It was just one of the perks of being a senior and one of the drawbacks of being a freshman. They never got me, never. Still, I had problems making real friends at Curley. It wasn't a lack of good guys. The problem was a lack of transportation. Nobody drove during our freshman and sophomore years, and most of the guys I hung out with at school lived in exotic, faraway locations like Dundalk and Highlandtown. I also despised the immense pressure I felt to join a self-defining clique. Tribalism was raising its ugly head almost immediately. Perhaps I would have been less annoyed if I knew what clique I belonged in. I didn't. I did, however, know which ones I didn't belong to. I wasn't a motorhead, or a stoner, or an athlete. I wasn't a musician, or a brain, or one of the kids aiming for the priesthood. I certainly didn't consider myself a nerd. In the end, I became a member of the default clique, the alphabetical one. We were never permitted to pick our own seats in classes. The instructors always seated us in alphabetical order. As a result, most of my friends had last names with the letters starting from L to P. There were others, of course, but most of my friendships were born of simple alphabetical proximity. I honestly believe if my last name had been Bateman instead of Murphy, I would have ended up with an entirely different group of friends. As the years passed, I did find myself gravitating toward the kids with a more literary bent. My natural desire to write was enhanced by the encouragement I received from my freshman English teacher, Mr. Jones. He made us write essays practically every night, and he would call out my name for me to start reading mine before he even sat down behind his desk. My essays were always a hit. Despite the many diversions high school offered, I felt increasingly isolated. When I look back on those days, I picture myself as a loner, completely anonymous. But that wasn't true at all. I was actually somewhat popular. I was elected freshman class president. I mainly credit that achievement to my large and loyal St. D contingent and the fact that I was such a goofball that everybody in the class recognized me. Still, later during my senior year, when the natural leaders of the student body had already emerged, I was elected once again to the student council. I wasn't a loner. I wasn't anonymous. Not really. I just felt that way.
I hope you enjoyed that chapter of my book, The Promise, or The Pros and Cons of Talking with God. It's available on Amazon and all other quality booksellers. Please, if you have the opportunity, check out my webpage, SeanPaulMurphyville.blogspot.com, for all things Sean Paul Murphy. See you next week with another chapter, hopefully.